This episode is brought to you by Content Multiplied. It's not a secret anymore that content creation is really important, but very few people talk about the importance of consistency. And I myself have really struggled with that consistency. And for that reason, I looked for a solution, and Content Multiplied was a really good one for me. Since using them, I've been able to focus on what I enjoy the most, which is recording podcasts, while Myla and her team are really taking care of everything else. Whether you have a podcast, you're holding keynote speeches, you're doing a YouTube series, you're writing a blog, a newsletter, a book, the Content Multiplied team can really take whatever you're producing and repurpose it into a series of micro content. And suddenly you have dozens and dozens of pieces that can be shared for you. And Content Multiplied even takes care of that for you. Unlock your content superpower with Content Multiplied and go to contentmultiplied.com today. That's contentmultiplied.com. Thanks, Myla. And let's go into the show. You are listening to Impact Hustlers, and I am your host, Michael Schaffert. I have made it my mission to inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs to solve some of the world's biggest social and environmental problems. And for this reason, I am speaking to some of the best entrepreneurs out there who are solving problems such as food waste, climate change, poverty, and homelessness. My goal is that Impact Hustlers will inspire you either by starting an impact business yourself, by joining the team of one, or by taking a small step, whatever that may be, towards being part of the solution to the world's biggest problems. In today's episode, I speak to Iulian Circo, the co-founder of Hyfe, an AI-driven tool that is able to detect coughs through a smartphone app. This technology is now used to produce more reliable data for clinical studies worldwide, such as studies researching COVID19 and tuberculosis. Iulian has started a range of successful companies and nonprofits and has been on a journey to combine social impact and profit since he left the humanitarian sector a few years ago. It's really great to have you on the show, Iulian, and thanks for making the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I'm very excited about this.
Let's do this. All right. So, as I already said, you started your career as a humanitarian and have focused your work on a range of different social issues since then. Tell us a bit more about your story and why are you doing what you do?
So I have a non-linear evolution in my career, Michael, and I think that's typical. It's typical for entrepreneurs, and I think to some extent it's typical for humanitarian workers, at least the ones that kind of make it long-term in the humanitarian sector. People tend to be non-linear, and I think that's a good thing, and it's something that I see as a huge advantage and something that we should respect more in these days. So I started my career as a humanitarian worker, and that's probably because I came of age in the 80s, I guess, and early 90s, at the time when there were fundamental changes happening all around us. I was really close to some of those changes, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, whatever came after it, all the conflicts of the 90s, from the Balkans to East Timor to later on Afghanistan. And my original passion has been human rights protection, basically, and that's my background. I've specialized in human rights protection, and I've embarked on a career working in human rights protection and focusing mostly on post-conflict environments. I spent a lot of time in kind of working with displaced persons, working in kind of in the first line of response after a conflict, those sorts of settings, and I loved every minute of that. It's just like, it's very satisfying work. The BS to impact ratio is optimal in my opinion. It's very kind of action oriented. I love the energy. I love the people that end up working and being high performance in that environment. and ultimately it's a highly educational thing to do, So, and I kind of lived off a suitcase for 10 years, moving from East Timor to Somalia to places like this. And yeah, I mean, it's been amazing, and it's opened my eyes not only to the need to do this sort of work and to the sort of the complexity of like the impact space, but also to the way that people are resilient and the way that people in any kind of circumstances preserve their humanity, and finally also in the way that they take technology in an environment like that and they use it to improve their lives. So technology in kind of critical environments, in extreme kind of environments, technology is a lifesaver, and it's definitely a multiplier for people trying to get things done, to stay close to their families. And I credit that to my obsession throughout the rest of my career in trying to find emerging technologies, trying to find ways to use these emerging technologies in ways that we can achieve impact at scale. So that's been my first career, and eventually I kind of pivoted into more traditional development, which is kind of similar in the sense that you're in emerging markets, in places without too much infrastructure, but the objective is very different. You're in traditional development, your job is to create sustainable infrastructure, to create impact that's kind of long term, whereas in a humanitarian setting, the impact's just like from a day to the next, basically. Let's just eliminate this critical situation, and you're not too worried about the long-term impact of that and sort of long-term sustainability. Very, very different setting, equally challenging, equally interesting. And so I've spent, I've had the fortune to be at the center of some very, very interesting projects. I was in the middle of the global response to the HIV epidemic. I've had the privilege to work in a country, Swaziland, which you mentioned before we spoke, that you also visited, which was the epicenter of the epidemic in those days. And I was based there, working with HIV, working with malaria, working with sanitation, and also working in ways that we were trying to build products and services that would use marketing principles to have impact. It's a very niche, it's a very small niche in global development, and one that's often ignored, because global development is kind of a top-down, a lot of money given to large organizations type setup. And we were, I again had the privilege to work with an organization and with a team where the objective was, can we take commercial principles and apply them basically to create markets that would make these needs that exist now, the need for products, for services, that would address them in ways that would not require us to be around forever providing these services, right? So we were working on things like, very detailed market segmentation and trying to find premium market segments where we could put a product that would be profitable, and then the profit of that premium segment product would be used to cross-subsidize the lower income kind of segments in that market, right? So you like, for example, you take a mosquito net and you just make a very premium product for it, for that 1% of the or 0.1% of the population, and you make an 80%, 100% margin on that because it's a premium product. And then the cash that you get from that margin, you'll apply to sell exactly the same product with a different brand, subsidized, right? So that people who could not afford to pay full price get a high quality product. And often, I can tell you this, it's the same product. It's just the brand's different. These are ways that you can bring these sorts of products into that market in ways that would work and would have an impact going forward. And going into kind of behavioral stuff and learning about consumer behavior in those markets, which are very, very different from consumer behavior principles that you learn if you do an MBA somewhere in Western Europe or in the US. So long story short, that another super educational period of my life. Loved it. And I became, like, out of that work, I became a kind of a reluctant entrepreneur, I guess. It's just like, I started to look at ways that we can use technology to make that sort of work better. And I've built first a piece of technology that became something that a lot of other organizations were interested in. And then that kind of launched me on an entrepreneurial journey, because we spun that out into a kind of a business, into a social enterprise. And we launched in a number of other countries, and the rest is kind of history. And from there on, I went and built a number of other companies across different sectors. And here I am 10 years later or whatever in my entrepreneurial journey, working in artificial intelligence and healthcare. Yeah.
Great, yeah, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I think one thing that struck me when I looked at your profile and your experience is you've spent a lot of your time as well working in war zones and really difficult environments. And I personally can't imagine an environment that's kind of scarier and full of uncertainty than a war zone. And trying to kind of organize things, getting things done in that type of environment. Do you think you've learned lessons in that time that you're still applying today to kind of this different type of uncertainty that you get with entrepreneurship? Obviously, it's not comparable, but I'm sure there's many difficult situations you had to overcome that will still help you today in terms of running companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have a pretty high tolerance to uncertainty. And, I guess I have a risk profile that is a bit on the riskier side than most people. And I guess that converts well into entrepreneurship. But at the same time, like, the one thing that I always say when, when I talk to people about, kind of volatile environments and kind of war situations, is that if you look at it from afar, it looks like a really, kind of like, it looks like everywhere you go, it's danger. The closer you go, the closer you are to humans, and the closer you are to humanity. It's just I mean, it's almost cheesy what I'm saying, but people get on with their lives, right? Like if you read those books from even in Europe during the Second World War, life just happened. Even there were atrocities happened left and right, but somehow people stayed close to their families, and they maintained social relationships, and they maintained their humanity throughout most of that. And that's something that I've seen again and again. And actually, I feel that there's different types of risk, right? And there's different types of violence that you're exposed to. But if you're in a place like, take Somalia, I lived 2 years in Somalia, and I've never actually felt unsafe the way that you might feel walking down a dodgy neighborhood in the US. It's a different type of safety or lack thereof, right? Like walking down a dodgy neighborhood in the US is I open myself up to randomness, right? Like there's an opportunity for someone to just randomly get violent or whatever. That never happens in Somalia. It just doesn't happen. If you're victim of which is very probable and possible, it's not a random thing that just happens. It's something that's part of a plan, well or not thought through, but it's a different type of risk that you're exposing yourself to. And the latter risk, although the consequences can be much worse, are also a bit easier to manage, right? Like it's a bit easier to plan your life in such a way that you don't put yourself into that situation, right? Like there's an armed conflict, don't take sides. It's kind of like there's some principles that you can follow, right? And you'll be okay, I guess. And actually, you meet people in places like this that are even, they're building thriving businesses, and they run, they manage their lives as they can, considering the circumstances. And that's that's like one of the biggest sources of optimism for me. Humanity will always prevail.
Yeah, I love it. I definitely haven't spent any time in war zones in my life. But when I was in South Africa, I did live in Johannesburg, and even that, when I told people about it, and initially I lived in a really safe suburb, supposedly safe, and later moved kind of into Soweto, which is kind of known as kind of the biggest township in South Africa. And a lot of people in Europe would be completely scared, me telling them that I live there and that I'm just kind of using the normal transport and all that. I think a lot of this is that, yeah, the closer you move, the more you see the reality and the humanity of people, and people actually doing positive things. Whereas if you zoom out and you're just following media loosely, you're seeing all the worst of the worst,
Right.
bad news and all that. So I can completely relate to that. Yeah. Um, let's move on to Hyfe, and that's the reason why I invited you. I think we could record a podcast for each of your startups, but we only have time for one today. So let's cover in a few sentences how does Hyfe work, and how is it different from existing solutions out there?
So, I mean, Hyfe is basically, it's a very simple product. It tracks coughs in real time, and it basically creates a longitudinal map of your coughing over time. And the craziest thing is that if you get sick now in London and you end up at the best hospital in London, and you're going to be connected to all sorts of super smart devices that will measure all these biomarkers about you. If you have a respiratory condition and you're coughing, your cough will be evaluated by the doctor coming in during the rounds in the morning and saying, Michael, how's your coughing? And you're going to say it's good or it's bad. And that's the extent of that evaluation. That's the clinical evaluation right there. So there is no, although cough is the most common symptom across all diseases, there is no way to quantify. And that's kind of something that is just like mind-bending for me. So we just built a way to quantify cough. And it runs, it runs on a phone, it runs we even have a small wearable that we're working on now and we're testing it out. It works on third-party devices. So we're not depending on this or the other device. Our core product is an algorithm, which is an artificial intelligence algorithm that detects cough in the real world. And it's different. There are teams working on this, and actually acoustic epidemiology is, in my opinion, one of the most exciting territories in healthcare, because it's so new, right? Like you have people look for signatures of diseases in all sorts of sources, right? You have imaging, you go to a laboratory, there's an X-ray, you have chemical stuff where they take blood or lymph, they run an analysis. But sound, no one's done anything about sound. Yet if you talk to a doctor, they will tell you an experience that will tell you, I can listen to this person, I can listen to their coughing, I can listen to their wheezing, and I can tell you a lot about what's wrong with them. Yet no one's built anything in that space, right? So there are more and more teams, and I'm happy to say that we're kind of the pioneers in this space, and we're definitely the market leader, definitely in cough. And the way that we're different, and we managed to come on the top of this market so quickly, is that your typical machine learning team comes out of a university. That's what happens, right? You have a bunch of really smart people in a really good university, and they look at it as an interesting scientific question. Can we build a machine that can detect coughs, or can we build a machine that can classify different types of coughs? And then they go about being super smart and super academic about this. And the first challenge will be, okay, it's a machine learning model, so it needs a data set to be trained on. So they just walk down the aisle at the university where they're based, and they ask everyone they meet, hey, could you please cough into this microphone, cough. And then, they have enough people coughing. They have like maybe 1,000 or 500 people coughing, and that's the starting data set. But there's two foundational problems with that. One is that data set has a social demographic bias. And this is a big problem. In this day and age, this is a very common problem, and maybe one of the most solid arguments against AI models, right? There's a bias inherent in the way that you build a data set, right? Because, people, if you are in the corridor of a university where there's a smart team asking people to provide coughs, there's already a huge bias there. You're probably, first of all, there's an age bias. Then there's a kind of social demographic background bias. Then there's a geographic bias. And then you build a model that is based on this group. And because the model is just unstructured, it just looks for patterns. 10 years down the road, you'll have a crazy bias coming into your outputs from that model, or for the evolved version of that model, that you will never be able to address, right? So that's a huge problem. And you see versions of this, extreme versions of this, when people do bots and put them on Twitter, and 2 days later, the bots just spurring racist tweets, right? Because the bot trains on basically what happens there, and what happens there, some people are louder than others, and often the people who are loud have very extreme opinions, and there's a bias in that model, and you can't fix that. You just have to rebuild the model, right?
So what have you trained your models? What have you trained your models with? What kind of data?
So amazing. I love this. So we decided to build this, and 1 week later, we had an app in the App Store. We just put an app out there. And we, our assumption was that there are enough people out there that care about tracking their cough. They care about the novelty of it, and they care about the potential value, that they will just do it, even if the model's really bad. So the first version of the model was really bad. But as people started downloading it, it got better and better, and we bypassed that first problem that AI teams have, because our users were from all over the world, across all demographics, right? So we had waves of users coming in from like Pakistan and Bangladesh and North India and China and like all sorts of places, Latin America, Europe, Africa. And that allowed us, old people, young people, educated people, taxi drivers. And that allowed us to make sure that our model is built on very diverse data set. The second bias, and this is very interesting, and it's probably specific to cough and a few other things, is if I say to you now, Michael, I'm about to take a screenshot, please smile. You're going to do this. And everybody sees that that's a smile, but fundamentally it's a fake smile. It's a manufactured smile. And if our thesis is that there's information in a cough, then we want that cough to be organic. It's like, if I want to see how Michael laughs, I have to crack a really good joke. And there's a difference between Michael's laugh after I crack that joke and Michael's laugh when I say, please laugh, cheers, I'm taking a picture. And this is the other bias that you have in basically models built by academic teams. They go around and ask people to cough into a microphone, or they set up a website and say, please go to this website and cough. But you're missing all that subtle organic signal that would be present if your cough happens naturally. And it's not only signaling the amplitude of in the structure of that one cough, but it's longitudinal stuff. Was it 3 coughs? Was it a cluster of 3 coughs, or was it just one cough? And then you add to that context. Oh, it always happens at night. Oh, it always happens when you lie down, or after you eat, or after you had ice cream. There's all these other variables that you can add in, which all convert into signal that can help us detect things, and not us, but our models detect things that could not be otherwise, they wouldn't be obvious. So yeah. A really long story to tell you how our models are different, and that's kind of our biggest moat. And I can tell you that right now we have, because of this approach, we just put an app on the market. We made sure that we create value for as many people as possible. We have the largest cough data set in the world by far. I can tell you that we have almost 140 million samples in our data set. And I was just reading a paper in the other day, which I'm happy to share with you, where someone's proposing a way to count cough, and they had like 48 samples, and they were like, "Oh my God, we have 48 samples from 11 people, and we have 140 million. In fact, there's so many of them that it's our biggest bottleneck. We just don't have the bandwidth to process all of it, and every day there's more and more sounds because we have so many users that use our app,
Got it. Super interesting. So I guess the biggest use case for an app and for a technology like this at the moment is research, right? So I mentioned in the beginning that your technology is already used for some COVID-19 research, some tuberculosis research, and I can imagine how this is being run without your solution. It's probably being run by asking people, how often did you cough in the last day, or something like that. Is that the case? How does it work without your solution? And then, yeah. This episode is brought to you by Content Multiplied. I've been using Content Multiplied to produce the Impact Hustlers podcast, as well as for repurposing each episode into a number of pieces of micro content that are then shared across our social media channels. Everybody's talking about creating content. I think it's not a secret anymore that content creation is really important, but very few people talk about the importance of consistency. And I myself have really struggled with that consistency. And for that reason, I looked for a solution, and Content Multiplied was a really good one for me. With all the moving pieces in the business, you can't spend all your time creating and pushing out new content. And that's why I've started working with Myla and her team at Content Multiplied, which always goes above and beyond. And they are all-in-one content management and repurposing service that can handle really all your content needs. Since using them, I've been able to focus on what I enjoy the most, which is recording podcasts, while Myla and her team are really taking care of everything else. Whether you have a podcast, you're holding keynote speeches, you're doing a YouTube series, you're writing a blog, a newsletter, a book, the Content Multiplied team can really take whatever you're producing and repurpose it into a series of micro content. And suddenly you have dozens and dozens of pieces that can be shared for you. And Content Multiplied even takes care of that for you. They can also help you strategize, multiply, and transform your content into more engaging formats that your audience will love. Unlock your content superpower with Content Multiplied and go to contentmultiplied.com today. That's contentmultiplied.com. Thanks, Myla, and let's go into the show.
That's the case. That's the case. So the established way to do this is to either ask people, like if you run a study at large scale, you basically have to ask people, because otherwise it's just not possible. If you run a small scale study, there are some products out there which are basically MP3 recorders, like tape recorders, that participants are given. They basically strap them around their neck, like a little thing like this. And they have to keep that on them for 24 hours. And then they bring it back to the investigator, who then hires people to sit with a headphone and listen to 24 hours of someone's life. Accelerated, you can just do a 2x and eliminate the pauses. And then every time there's a cough, they have a clicker, cough, 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 and that's how they count the coughs. And that's basically the alternative to our product. And it's a no-brainer. It's our product works at any scale, virtually. You can run cohorts, and not only do you get the charts for everyone, you can even you can dive in and sort of analyze individual groups, cohorts, all of that. So that's kind of an interesting market for us. We also have a consumer product. We have an app in the App Store, which we don't make any money out of. We don't sell anything. No one pays us for that. We don't sell the data. And the only reason why we have that is, first of all, because we're creating a category. We don't come into a category where there's a playbook. Like if you build a SaaS product, there's kind of a playbook. You have to have a license, and this is how it is, and people have to click here, and it has to run in a cloud. Where we are, there's no playbook. So what we do is we have to work with. We have to discover basically where the market is and where the value is, and then we have a consumer product, because the number one priority for us is to provide a lot of value for people and learn how that value converts into people's behavior, right? And once we understand that, we get more data from these people because they continue to use our app. B, we get a lot of feedback from them and insights. What do they want? How do how the chart needs to be? What features they want? And 3, we convert all of that into our other products. So we stay on top of this market when we define this category of cough tracking using AI.
Got it. And what difference does this actually make? Obviously, it's much more accurate. You're actually capturing the accuracy of how many people, how often people actually cough. But what does that mean for actually the clinical use cases, for example, for the research use cases? What are you enabling by doing this?
So there's different use cases, and we're enabling for each of them. It's kind of slightly different, right? So for the consumer use case, we're putting in the hands of a patient a very powerful tool, which is data, right? Because there's people out there, and maybe you even have in your extended kind of circles, people who just cough and they don't understand why. There's a mix of allergies or something that happened, they got sick, they never got better, and just cough, the cough doesn't go away. It's shocking to learn that 10% of adults worldwide have some form of cough that they can't really explain. And these people have similar journeys. They go to some doctor, the doctor says, oh, take some weeks, or get some rest, have some tea with honey, because there isn't really much that they can do about it. And then eventually they're frustrated, their quality of life is affected, and eventually they get to the point where they try to take things into their own hands, right? So they change their diet. They say, well, if I don't eat gluten, maybe my cough will go down, or if I don't eat in the evening, or I have less acid in my, people just have all sorts of theories that they experiment with, and our app provides them a way to find correlations. Oh, on Tuesday I stopped eating gluten, and look, my cough frequency went down. Because cough frequency is something that the human brain just doesn't register, right? If I ask you now, how many times you coughed yesterday, and was it more than the day before, you have no idea, right? Although you probably coughed about 20 times yesterday, you have no idea about that, because the brain doesn't register. The second thing is they go to the doctor and say, hey, look, and we actually have these amazing stories of teams of doctors and patients basically working together to customize either the treatment or the management of a condition, because they can see the objective way in which cough frequency changes with decisions that they take together, right? So that's kind of one like. On the research side, it's the same thing. Like if you want to put on the market a treatment, a vaccine within a respiratory pandemic, you're working on a vaccine or you're working on a treatment, you have to know if the treatment affects the cough of those people in any way, right? Of your cohort. So you have 3 cohorts. You have your treatment cohort, your placebo cohort, and you have your control cohort. Cough is probably an endpoint. It's probably an important piece of information that you look at as you're doing these trials, because you have to see if the symptoms, which cough is an important symptom, are affected in any way by the treatment, right? And if you're working on something like that, then we're probably the best tool you can get, because the alternative is to send people home with tape recorders and have other people listen to them. And finally, and probably the most interesting use case, which is, we're not there yet because there's regulatory things, is that I believe that the healthcare, just like everything else, will go digital more and more, right? And that means that when you go to the doctor and get a prescription, there's a digital side of that prescription. And this digital side could be a wearable. So, you get a treatment for something, that you go to the pharmacy, they give you the pill, and they ask you, hey, here's an app, or here's a wearable. And then you go home, and as you take that pill, the wearable monitors your biomarkers that are relevant to your treatment. And the doctor, who could be next door or in the next state or on the other side of the world, or a machine, could look at this data that comes from a biomarker and take decisions that to optimize your treatment, so that your secondary effects are reduced, the impact of the medication is higher. They do micro doses adjustments, and you get everybody wins. You, as a patient, you get a custom treatment, faster outcome. As a doctor, you get better outcome from your patients. And as a payer, you get to pay less because there's less complications, and the treatment doesn't take as long as it would take if it wouldn't be customized. And I'm a huge believer in that use case. I'm very bullish on that use case.
Amazing. I can't wait for you to move into that space as well and see more of that. I think next up, I would love to move into covering some of the lessons learned from your journey and how you've approached starting the different companies and organizations you've started. And one pattern that struck me is when I look at the different organizations you started Triggerize, which is actually a charity that's using data as well to connect people to essential services, healthcare as well in developing countries. You co-founded Proof of Impact, which is a platform for social and environmental impact measurement. Hyfe, where you just spoke about how crucial data is to your business and to the outcomes that you produce. but at least officially, you're not a data scientist. You don't have a PhD in data science or anything like that. How did you approach running such data-driven businesses in the early days? Is it something that you've basically trained yourself, or are you working with a co-founder? How are you making sure that you got like the right skills in the team as well to run these data-driven businesses?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting perspective, and it's one that I actually didn't spend a lot of time thinking about. And thanks for giving me this perspective. I think, I mean, I've always been, coming from development in particular. You have so much data, right? But most of it is just garbage, to be honest. If you think of a typical kind of development project, you get the money given top down from some donor, typically, and that money comes with a long list of indicators that you have to report on, right? And most of those indicators are either super complex, so you can't actually, it's not like something that you can check in every day to see what you're doing, right? Or they're kind of inputty. You can control them in ways that you shouldn't be able to control them. Like a typical example is you report a lot of trainings. Oh, we've trained a lot of people, but that's just an input. That if with enough resources, I can scale training endlessly, right? Because it's just like I find people, I train them. How does that convert into impact? I don't know, and actually, I'm not sure it does. And that's one of the original frustrations that I had coming from the humanitarian sector into the development sector. That the indicators that basically the needle that you're watching to see, is my work moving the needle or not, is very fuzzy. You don't really see that needle, right? And I think that's a huge missed opportunity. So I thought, there's so much technology around us. Back in the day, I understand it was hard to measure outputs of anything. But in this day and age, there's so much technology that could convert, that it would be easy to convert data into outputs that you could measure every day, So I still am very passionate about that. And I actually think that running a business and running a startup in particular, where you don't have a lot of resources and you don't have a lot of bandwidth, that's a very healthy attitude to have, to sort of always be very rigorous in deciding what is the metric that moves my needle. And how do I stay away from metrics that are either easy to game or irrelevant to my long-term kind of business? And it's harder than it sounds, right? And there's people out there who define metrics for themselves, even in startups, that are vanity metrics that are just they don't really convert into growth to your business. And it's a problem that I'm fascinated for. And I mean, I'm kind of data literate. I'm not a data scientist, but I'm data literate. And I'm very much into trying to cut through the BS and find that one or two metric that is easy to measure, is output based, so hard to game, and it moves the needle of the business, And it's just something that I think you have to do. And it gets easier as technology penetration increases.
Got it. I think we got quite a bit of an audience in this podcast of people that are maybe currently in a corporate job or actually working for charities, working in the humanitarian sector, and that would love to learn from your lessons, making that transition from humanitarian sector into entrepreneurship. What do you think are opportunities for people out there currently in the humanitarian space? Would you advise them, get out of there and innovate, start a company, join a company, do something good through a company? Or is there a lot of kind of more forward-thinking organizations out there now, more data-driven organizations? What would be your advice to people that are keen to kind of make a difference, make a change, but are currently working in the humanitarian space?
I think there has never been a better time to go on your own in that sector, to be honest, And I think that, there's several reasons for that. One is that the development sector in particular, humanitarian space a bit different because it's really hard to, and if you focus on making a commercial success in the humanitarian sector, you may miss the opportunity to deliver impact. So the trade-off between impact and commerce needs to bias towards impact 100% in the humanitarian sector. So that's kind of like a different area. But in development, and by development I mean something that's quite broad, like anything that has like a positive impact against one of the 17th indicators, I guess, anywhere in the world. There's never been a better time because the traditional top-down model is dying. And it's dying because the way that it's financed, the way that it's been financed traditionally is changing. And I mean, I don't want to rabbit hole, but here's the only two ways in which traditional development funding has been committed to impact. One is people sign every month a check, individuals, you and I, sign every month a check to an organization that we feel strongly, either because they represent a cause that we believe in, or because they have a great reputation. And that's kind of a boomer thing. Like, the new generation just doesn't do that. And if you're looking at any, I'm happy to put a bet out there. Any traditional organization that depends on individual donations is racing towards a cliff right now, because as the generations are changing, the baby boomers who are comfortable with paying 200 euros a year or whatever to their favorite charity are just dying out. And the new generation just doesn't do that. It's not a behavior that they do. They just don't sign blind checks to some organization because they have pictures with starving children on that model's dead. But I see there an opportunity, because at the same time, this generation that doesn't sign checks like their parents used to, they're way more committed to impact than their parents. So you have this gap, which is a huge business opportunity. You have people who are super keen to cause or to kind of trigger and facilitate impact through their behavior, right? That's why you see so many brands that claim, for better or worse, that they're sustainable, that they're organic, that they're not harming the environment, that they're local. That's because the new consumer really cares about it. They genuinely care about that, and that's amazing. I'm so happy about that, right? I call this the impact generation. They care about purpose. Yet the organizations that could deliver this purpose, tons of it, at scale, they're just not innovating. They're not aware of it because they're heads down, doing things the way they've done it for so many years. And that's a huge opportunity, right? For if you have an idea, if you want to build a business in that space, this is the time, because the consumers are ready. The government donors are ready as well, because that's the second source of top-down money, right? Taxpayers are ready for this. They're everywhere you go. There's a segment of the population that complains that too much money goes to foreign aid. It's one of the problems that we have in I guess in the Western world. People are they feel that money is wasted. They feel that money is not used well. But these are not bad people. These are not people who don't care about impact. They would be super happy to see their taxes put into impact in ways that are transparent, that are kind of, that you can measure, and that are combining perhaps that impact with some sort of sustainable commercial story. So fantastic opportunities. At the same time, if you go into the places that used to be the traditional recipients of aid, the infrastructure is changing there. Internet is everywhere. Smartphones are everywhere. The younger generation is educated. It's exposed to, they've been exposed to the same cultural things like everybody else. They're on YouTube. They're on Instagram. So there's a huge opportunity now. Technology is finally being an equalizer in that sense. It's terrible in so many other ways, but in that sense, it's an equalizer. So you have people with money who are hungry for innovation and alternative ways to do impact. You have a whole generation committed to impact and defining themselves, their whole identity about that impact. And you have this equalizing force, which is technology, that brings everybody together in a way or another, or within reach. It's a lot easier to reach people today with information and with products than it was when I started my career, when you had to go to the radio and have some radio show, hoping that someone in the village will listen to that radio show, right? So I don't think there's been ever a better time to do it, and anybody who is thinking about doing that should absolutely do it right away.
Love
Not wait
it.
any longer, because they're probably going to be doing all right.
That's what we're here for, to inspire exactly that. I've got two more questions for you. One is, throughout your career as an entrepreneur, what do you think was kind of the hardest business lesson for you to learn? Like any lesson that you wish you knew when you started out?
Oh my goodness, Michael! I learned so, and I've learned them the hard way, to be honest. So I've here's like a quick fire list. I've over innovated, and this sounds counterintuitive. So I have made a mistake, which I see so many smart people doing, right? Of focusing their innovation resources on things that are not core to that business, right? So I wanted to innovate. I wanted to build a better website. This is probably the biggest mistake that anybody does who starts their first business. They just want to make this amazing website, and they spend a lot of time with it, and they spend a lot of energy with it, and sometimes they spend money with it. A website should take half an hour. There's a template. Just use the template. I wish I would have done this in the past. These days, that's what I do. I just take a template, half an hour later, boom, the first version of the website is ready. And then just look at the numbers and improve from there. Because templates have been built on the back of tens of thousands of companies building websites. And that sort of wisdom, you can never over innovate. It's a huge mistake. Then I've mistaken interest with willingness to buy, right? If I ask you, hey, what's important to you when you order things online? You're probably going to say, oh, I want my package to come quickly, right? But if I say, oh, would you pay $5 for that? You probably won't do it. So, and if you're out there researching your market and your customers and you're asking the wrong questions, you may build a business that no one wants to pay for. So that's another thing. And the way to do it is to just put your proposition out there in the real world as soon as possible. Don't worry about having a product ready. Don't worry about having it all thought through. Just test and ruthlessly, continuously test willingness to convert, people's willingness to pay. It applies to investors as well, by the way. Like, I've spoken to so many investors in my life, and often I've gotten them super interested because kind of like I'm an interesting guy, I guess. I have an interesting story. They want to have dinner. They want to have coffee, but that never convert. Like, a lot of dinners and a lot of coffees don't necessarily convert into, let me sign a check to invest in your business. And that's another painful lesson I've learned. So I mean, I can talk all day about this.
Yeah.
I try to educate my customers. That's another thing that you're building a product and you're thinking, oh, the customers are not ready for this product. Let me educate them. Huge mistakes. I've partnered with the wrong people. Like, oh my God, like every mistake in the book I've made.
We should do another episode on that. I think a good resource on talking to customers, which I feel like I'm a broken record on, and it's definitely not kind of like a hidden gem anymore. It's kind of the go-to manual for a lot of people. But around customer conversation, I think a book that is really valuable is The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick, which is all around how do you talk to customers in ways that you can actually validate your idea rather than get like some fake approval that doesn't actually tell you whether people would buy your solution. Just some advice for anybody listening. Last question to you, and a brief answer from you on that. How does the world look like in 10 years if Hyfe succeeds? How do you imagine it will look like? How do you want it to look like?
So I don't have the vanity to think that Hyfe will change the world. I don't think so. But I have the conviction that we are ahead of the trend. Like, we're in the best place a business can be, and that is you're early before the wave is building up, And that's that's the best way to scale a business, because you have the momentum, you have the wind behind you, And I think that in 5-10 years, healthcare will have modernized, right? Like, healthcare, if you look at healthcare like you would look at a product, it has a terrible user experience, like the worst user experience you could imagine, right? It's just high friction, low tech, really slow, expensive. It's everything we hate about products. That's healthcare on the interface, right? On the back end is really advanced. There's these super smart people, well educated, all the technology. But on the front end, it sucks. And and eventually it's going to be disrupted. And it's not us. I mean, we're playing a part in that, and we're out there in the battle, but it's going to be the product of others like us. And it's going to change, and it's going to change in a way that the patients will be more empowered and more in control and having just a better experience. And technology is a big part of that.
Love it. Can't wait to see those changes happening. And I mean, they're already happening right now, right? And healthcare is changing, but it's still a long road ahead. So thank you, Julian, for joining me today. Really insightful to have you on here, and thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I love this.
Thank you.